Welcome, I'm Ian for Bondian, and today we're going to rank the two Timothy Dalton James Bond movies. Yeah, there's only two, so it's not much of a ranking, but we are going to go through the two movies. I recently did a video on this channel about my first encounter with the cinematic Bond at the cinema, and that of course was Timothy Dalton. Timothy Dalton for me does hold a very dear place in my heart in terms of James Bond. I absolutely love his portrayal of Bond, and I think that the two movies he did are sorely underrated. So without further ado, we are going to talk about the two Timothy Dalton James Bond movies, and this is probably going to be quite a short video because we've only got two films to talk about. But in second place, I am going to put The Living Daylights. This was of course Timothy Dalton's debut as 007, and the script very much was written, in my opinion, in a very generic way, because bear in mind, originally, once Roger Moore had announced he was leaving, Kubrick Broccoli had pretty much hired, in fact he had hired Pierce Brosnan to be the new James Bond. Remington Steele that Brosnan was filming had been cancelled. NBC, I believe it was, still had an option on it, and when the Bond people hired Brosnan to be James Bond, that's when they exercised, NBC that is, exercised their right to bring Remington Steele back. Of course, that was a huge mistake because I think it only lasted like 1 or 2 episodes more, so Brosnan did lose his chance at becoming Bond. That was obviously rectified a number of years later in 1995's GoldenEye, but going back to The Living Daylights, Timothy Dalton, who had in fact been asked if he wanted to play Bond way back for Live and Let Die back at the beginning of the 70s, who had then turned the role down because he felt that he was too young, and I kind of get that. So Timothy Dalton was brought on board and he did an absolutely fantastic job, in my opinion, of portraying James Bond. Gone was the goofiness of Roger Moore. He played it with a lot more of a sort of serious edge, and it was exactly what Bond needed in the late 80s. After the lightness of the Roger Moore films, we did need something a bit more grounded, we did need something a bit more sort of hard-edged, and that is something that we would see through the two movies that Timothy Dalton eventually did, and that set, in my opinion, the whole series up for what would again later get with the Daniel Craig entries in the series, because I think Timothy Dalton really did pave the way for those harder edged movies that we got with Daniel Craig. Going back to The Living Daylights, the plot of the movie is, in my opinion, quite confusing, but it does play fairly well actually. The locations of the movie are used to great effect. Vienna just looks absolutely beautiful. Then of course we go to Afghanistan for the finale of the movie, and the stunts, for saying that a lot of these stunts were done for real in the late 80s, you do have an appreciation for what this movie really did bring to cinema, because those stunts that they did on that plane at the end of the movie, they took some doing. They were real, they were dangerous, and you can definitely feel that in places when you're actually watching the movie. In terms of Timothy Dalton's performance of James Bond, as I said, he does bring a serious sort of tone to the role. Timothy Dalton's portrayal of Bond is cold, it's calculating, he is an assassin, and you do get that completely different feeling that you never got with Roger Moore's portrayal. So the way Timothy Dalton played the part, absolutely fantastic. And he isn't without his quips. He does get a few of the one-liners in. He does play the part in a way that there's still a little bit of a lightness to it, but on the whole, it is more serious, more grounded. Mariam Darbo playing Cara Milovi is beautiful. She's a great Bond girl. She's just meant to be a normal person that just gets entangled with this because of her relationship with Koskov. And I feel the movie would have benefited had Walter Gottel come back to be able to reprise his role of General Gogol from the previous movies, but due to ill health he wasn't, hence the introduction of General Pushkin that Bond had encountered a few times in the past. Of course, Joe Don Baker makes his Bond series debut as Brad Whitaker, the arms dealer in this movie. Of course, he would go on later in the series, GoldenEye and Tomorrow Never Dies, to play Jack Wade, who I actually think he did a better job of in those movies. But all in all, this is a pretty good movie. I do enjoy it. However, it was eclipsed, in my opinion, with Licence to Kill. Of course, Licence to Kill came out 2 years after The Living Daylights in 1989, and this was the first time I encountered Bond on the big screen, and boy was it totally different to anything I'd seen before. Gone were a lot of the glamorous locations, although you say that, we did actually get scenes in the Florida Keys, we did get scenes in Mexico, and this film wasn't filmed at Pinewood Studios in London. This was filmed, I think, on location at a studio in Mexico. But the plot revolving around Bond going rogue after Felix Leiter has been savaged by a shark due to Franz Sanchez. Felix now works for the DEA, and of course Franz Sanchez and his cronies do murder Felix's new wife Della. The whole aspect of Bond going rogue, infiltrating this drug dealers organization and bringing the whole thing down from within, was completely different to anything we'd seen before, and it did, as I said, very much lay the foundation for the Daniel Craig era that we got later on. And I really did enjoy this film. And I do remember thinking to myself as like a 12, 13-year-old kid, was that a James Bond movie? It didn't feel like a James Bond movie. And it's one that I actually didn't really revisit for probably 4 or 5 years, even though it was sat on my sort of shelf on a VHS copy. I didn't really go back to it for a very long time. But when I did, I started to appreciate the movie for what it was. In terms of the two Bond girls in this movie, played by Carrie Lowell and Talisa Soto, they are absolutely perfectly cast, and Carrie Lowell is absolutely beautiful, as is Talisa Soto. Lupi is great as the sort of villain's girlfriend who seduces Bond, or Bond seduces, and she tries to use him to get out of the situation she's in. And Pam Bouvier as a CIA pilot, great casting. In terms of the whole action element of the movie, I did love this one. I loved the underwater sequences. The scuba diver sequences were really good, and it did encourage me to actually go diving in the Florida Keys, even though you don't get to see a lot of the underwater stuff in the movie. But again, I do love this movie for so many reasons, and that is why I place that at the top of these two movies. I absolutely love the change of pace. It's a breath of fresh air, and it is different to what we've had from every other Bond movie up to this date. So I really do rank Licence to Kill as my number one of Timothy Dalton's 2 Bond movies. But that is the ranking. It's just 2 movies. As I said, probably not going to be the longest of videos, but there's 2 movies that we had to talk about. Both of them are actually really good in their own right, but Licence to Kill for me just has this slight edge. Let me know in the comments below how you'd rank these 2 movies. Which is your favourite of Dalton's 2 Bond movies? And do you think he should have come back for a third? I would have loved to have seen his 3rd movie, but of course that never did come to fruition. But thank you very much for watching. If you do subscribe to this channel, I thank you so very much. And if you don't, please consider hitting the subscribe button. It really does help this channel to grow, and it won't cost you a penny, and we are trying to grow this channel with new content coming every Sundays. But that is going to do it for me. I'll catch you next video. Thank you very much for watching.